So we're going to start today with our darkest colors, which are going to be our Terra Verde and our violet. Then we're going to have an intermediate, slightly lighter and more green color that we're going to mix with the Terra Verde and ochre, and a little tiny bit of either violet or ultramarine blue. Then we want a third one. This is going to be Terra Verde and ochre all by itself. So let's get started with mixing that up. So we're going to mix up our Terra Verde and violet first. It's going to be our no tan color and our darkest dark. Because remember, at night the colors become much closer together, except for the intensities. So our values will be closer together, and our hues will be closer together, and our temperatures will be somewhat closer together, but our intensities will remain higher in contrast. So let me take just a tiny little bit of that violet and add it into the Terra Verde. And we may need a little bit more of that. We're going to use that to make a very dark green. I want it to still look green, so going very slowly on how much violet goes in there. So they're close in value, but slightly different in hue. Then this remaining pile of Terra Verde is going to become our little bit warmer green, and we're going to have some yellow ochre in there, and we'll also make a pile that is a little bit less green. So this is going to be one of our lightest colors in the field that's illuminated by moonlight. And even though it's a middle value, it will read as a highlight because it's warmer and lighter, but still in the same hue range. All of them have have green in there. So we may need a little plain yellow ochre, so that is over there on the side. I'm going to take the little bit of that yellow ochre Terra Verde mixture that's in there and add it to the yellow ochre, just so they'll have a little bit of color in common. It's a really good idea to kind of mess up your colors so they have that commonality to them and they all are harmonious. So it takes just the edge off the yellow ochre. Then our other colors in there are primarily blues. So the sky is quite dark. So I'm going to give us 2 piles of ultramarine blue. And we're going to have one that is a little bit more violet and one that is a little bit less. We're going to need a little bit of white to make it opaque so that it will lighten it up just a little bit, brighten it up just a little bit. So I'm going to go slow with the white because I don't want to make it too light. And I also don't want it to be too intense either, because one of the things that makes the sky look like night is it becomes more of an indigo, more of a blue violet. So that's ultramarine blue with a little bit of white in it. Then I'm going to make it a little violet by adding a very small amount of purple to darken it up and warm it up even more. So notice that this now makes all of our colors have a common thread in them. Every last one of them that we have down here, need a little bit more purple, has some purple in it, so that there is a hue connection between all of them. That hue connection is going to be one of the things that will help us create the illusion of night, of a nocturne. So that is our brighter and slightly lighter blue for the sky. You can add a little tiny bit more white to it to make it a little lighter. It's not going to take much. Remember, we want to lighten a little bit at a time. We want a contrast between these two, since those are our darkest darks and some of our lightest lights. So remember that our values get much closer together in a nocturne. So we're going to lighten it up just a little bit more. So that it will have enough contrast to stand out from the no-tan color. So we have to exaggerate the contrast just a hair when we're painting, or it's not going to show. Remember, people look from a distance, not right on top of a painting. So one of the things that's going to help this look separate in shape and pattern from the no-tan is the intensity and the contrast in value. So our darker one can have even more purple in it, and it will be a blue violet. And it will be very, very violet compared to the first one. Then we're going to split that one so that we have a third blue. It's going to be a lighter blue. And I'm putting some more white in there. And to separate it from the first one, you may need a little bit more violet. We want three distinct, very distinct, different blues there. So our lightest blue is going to be both lighter and even cooler. Warmer. Going the wrong direction there. So we're lightening it up another notch. This is going to indicate our little slight cloud. And it probably needs to go a little bit more because we're going to add some more violet to it. Lighten it up a little more, and then we can add our purple to it to make it separate out even more. What we want is for it to look distinctly different. And while it looks light enough all on its own, it does not look light enough when it's next to our blue, our main blue for the sky. And that should do it. Yep, that's going to give us enough of a difference. And we'll add a tiny little bit of purple to it to purple it up even more. And that gives us even more contrast. Now, the last color I'm going to add in here is going to be one that's kind of a linkage. It's going to be a yellow ochre. And I'm going to take some of this purple that we just mixed here and add it to the yellow ochre to dull it down. Then I'm going to add a little bit more white to it. And this is going to be our fence posts. Actually, I'm going to take some more yellow ochre, go up here. And just keep dulling that ochre down without making it too dark. So this is basically just yellow ochre and blue violet. Because I want a color, add a little bit more, that is going to give us a lighter value when it's up against the greens that we can use for our fence posts. And that tiny little bit of white will actually intensify it just a hair. because there's enough transparent color in there. And we get a nice neutral that again is going to relate to everything else. So notice every single thing in there has violet in it. So we have two other colors to mix up. We need a cool light color. So we're going to take a little bit of white and I'm going to put it right here. We're going to need some more white for our moon. Now for this one we need a really cool, somewhat lighter, so we're going to take our blue violet, and yes, this is going to be dull, but we need for it to be dull. It is a very pale, pale color. So it's going to be blue violet with a tiny little bit of yellow ochre in it so that it's not too intense, but it's still a cool color. So this is going to be a color that we can use for some of those very light, cool colors. They'll mix with everything else and darken up a little bit. So we're mixing lighter than the final color in the painting. Now our moon, we're going to mix with yellow ochre and white. And you'll be surprised at how intense that is. Get a little bit more yellow ochre out here. And we're going to keep it light. And we'll darken it with the yellow ochre very slowly because we don't want to go too fast. We'll add a tiny little bit of Indian yellow to it in just a moment, but we're starting with the yellow ochre to get it to around the correct value. Then we'll add a little bit of Indian yellow to get it to the correct intensity. We don't want it to be pure Indian yellow and white because that's going to be too intense. So there's our Indian yellow and white. And you can see how dull that looks. So we're going to brighten that up with just a tiny little bit of Indian yellow. It's not going to take much at all. Just remember, Indian yellow is that dye color that is extremely strong, much stronger than any of the ochres. So squeeze a little bit out. And a very small amount. And that brightens it right up. That tiniest little bit did it. And again, then it relates to all of the other colors because it has the yellow ochre in common with so many of them. So that makes a palette that then is unified because of the related elements. So remember that when we're working with a nocturne, the values are going to be closer, the hues are closer, the intensities can still have greater contrast, and the temperatures are going to be closer. So now we're ready to dive in. So let's dive into our painting. We're going to start, as we usually do, with our no-tan color. So get some of the purple and terre verte, and I'm using the 109 knife to dive in there. So our main no-tan, our main darker pattern comes from this tree mass that's right here in the main section of the composition. This is a small wood on the edge of a pasture. And the moon is going down, or coming up, rising rather, not going down. The moon is rising behind the trees, peeking through the trees, and giving us a strong sense of light right there, even though it's about 9 o'clock at night, 8 or 9 o'clock at night. So there's a surprising amount of light when there's moonlight. Remember that moonlight tends to be cool, but that doesn't mean you're not going to have any warm colors. You're just not going to have as strong a contrast, and you're not going to have as wide a range of values. Now I can also add in this section where the fence line gives us a little shadow going down here, and that provides for the composition a really nice diagonal line that'll help lead the viewer's eye across the picture plane. Now notice I'm moving that a little bit so that it's not ending up smack dab in the center. Here's where the moon will go. So I want to bring the viewer's eye over to right about here where that moon is going to be. So I'm going to bring them in with a diagonal and then lead them back out with a diagonal, but keep them in the picture plane. So that's a really useful shadow there that we're going to pull into the composition. Once the no-tan is on there, remember to thoroughly wipe and clean your knife in between. You can now begin to establish those darkest darks down here or work in the sky. My personal preference is I tend to begin to work into that sky color because that's going to be one of our lightest colors. So I'll turn it so that it's easier to bring the knife in here. And you can bring that color right up to, you don't have to overlap with the no-tan, but bring it right up to it. And keep it thin. See, you can see the tone through the paint there. I can come back and make the paint thicker, but when I'm first putting it down, it is really useful to have it applied thinly. Don't try to leave sky holes in the trees too much right now. You're going to come back and pull those out. People get into trouble when they try to paint around sky holes. Works much better to pull them out afterwards and deal with just those big shapes. We've talked about that a lot, but it never hurts to repeat it and remind ourselves of that process. You'll paint much faster and more efficiently, more expressively, if you're not trying to paint around things all the time. So I'm leaving a little space there, which makes it easier to dance back and forth between the two colors. I want you to notice how close they are in value, but how different they are in intensity. They're even somewhat close in hue. So once I have that established, I can turn the painting back around, and I can establish this darker green down at the bottom that is going to appear more intense in the beginning, but it's going to get covered with some other greens that are going to, it's going to appear darker in the beginning. It's going to lighten up just a little bit in just a minute. So we'll get that green on here. And when you're trying to figure out which color goes in which area, remember to use a color spotter when in doubt, so that you're isolating the color you're looking at from everything else that you see. So again, that first layer is going on really thinly. You don't want it to be too thick because then it's hard to apply the next layer of paint on top of it. And I'm going to put another bit of green over here, even though very little of that green is going to show in the end. Okay, we have the basic values and colors laid out really quickly. And again, you can see how very, very close together those values are. That's what's going to give us that sense of a nighttime sky. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to begin to put some more detail into the field in front and into the sky. The tree mass is going to remain very, very dark. So I'm going to go back in there just a little bit and play with some of the blue violet as well as the green violet to give a little bit of variation, but there's not going to be a whole lot. That's going to be a relatively dark mass. So I'm just going to begin to thicken that paint up just a little bit. And do that with all of the other areas as well. So let's dive down in here and begin to create some of our lighter areas in the field here. So this is the terre verte and yellow ochre, and it is much thicker than the other colors that we've used so far. I'm applying it really loosely right now to begin to break up this foreground shape just a little bit. And I can blend that into the terre verte so that we don't have quite as much contrast there. So that's just the yellow ochre and the terre verte. Now when you have too much paint left on, remember you can scrape it off with the other knife. And I can go in here, just a little tiny bit of it, and begin to play with that, softening that edge just a little bit. Not going to have quite as hard an edge with less light. It's just like that atmospheric condition that we dealt with last time. The edges will be a little bit softer and a little bit less distinct. So now we have also a little bit of lighter value on this other side of the fence. So we need to go into here and pull some of it up this way as well. Come back and tweak that a little bit. Then we can go into the sky. So I'm going to turn that upside down. And now remember I said we were putting that paint down very thinly. So now we've gotten a little bit in there. Now we can do what I call dancing back and forth. We can go play with this edge in here. And we can soften it and harden it where we need to. We can begin to build the paint up. And I like to leave a little bit of the tone showing through in places. It helps to separate out the masses when the values are getting really close together. But how much you do of that becomes your choice and decision, your artistic decision. So I'm pulling thicker paint on here and I'm holding the knife almost flat. If you're working with a brush, you need to be holding it almost parallel to the surface and applying the paint with a very, very light touch. It is far easier to do if you're working on an easel to turn the painting upside down than it is to pull it against the way you normally would hold the knife or the brush. So I need to pick up a little here on this side and make that line a little bit less regular. Now, what I meant by the dance back and forth is that you can push paint back out and pull it down, and you will end up with a more interesting line here than if you just painted around everything. So I call that the push and pull or the dance. Use that to make that edge a little bit more irregular. To go back and forth with your color to pull some blue down into that violet, and now you're beginning to actually get in there and deal with some sky holes and some spaces in between. But you want to pull out rather than paint around. It gives you a more realistic, believable space. Now, the next thing I want to do, pull that down just a little bit, is to take some of that lighter violet right here, and I want to add that little trailing cloud that I see up here. That breaks up that sky really nicely. So there's a huge difference when I put it on there. Then I'm going to go down and break that down a little bit and soften it up. But you don't want to have exactly the same blue across the whole thing. So I'm actually going to blend this down. Take it almost all the way down. And then I can turn this, and I can pull some of the darker blue back into that. So I want to emphasize that when you're thinking about edge, you don't want to have the same edges all the way across. So I want to make some of this harder and some of it softer, and that means I may need to go in there with my smaller knife, soften that up. And let's see what we need to do next. We need to add some more of that blue violet, dark blue violet that I was talking about, up towards where the sky is. And it will stand out from the green violet. And help us to break up that space more. So again, I'm holding the knife almost parallel to the surface of the painting. And I'm just using that, pulling that darker blue violet across the paint so that it doesn't pull up the darker purple, or rather the purple green, but lays the blue violet atop it. It begins to break up the Terra Violet mixture. So where I need to, I can then take my smaller knife, go in and pull some of that up, break that line up a little bit. And pull it down just a hair here. Blend it in so there's not a hard edge where it starts. Notice how thin that paint is. It's really thin. So about the only thing left for us to do is to establish where the moon is and to put in some of those very, very light fence posts. So our moon is right about here. So to put the moon in, we're going to pull paint out. So use your smaller knife to pull paint off. Doesn't matter what medium you're using, you need to pull paint off. Then you're going to take some of our lightest yellow and in one stroke, put it in. Wipe. And turn your knife. Soften those edges. Don't worry about it being a circle. It is not actually a circle as your eye looks at it. It is more of an oval and the edges are slightly softened. Then the same basic thing applies for putting in the fence post. There is one right back here. So push out where you want it to be. And there's another right here. Push out where you want it to be and wipe off. Carry that over as far as you need to. What the fence does for us compositionally is again create some nice strong repetition and bring the viewer's eye all the way across to the moon. Now you have a hard time in the photo actually seeing another fence post. They are there. And I would put just the least little hint of them in there to help compositionally establish that line. Then we're going to take our lightest violet there and we're going to put just a touch and we're going to go over that with a darker color too to tone down that contrast. So where you've got too much paint down, pull off a little bit. You can pull off whether you're using a knife or a brush, and pulling off still will leave a little bit of a mark. Don't worry about it being precise because you can go back in there and put some darker paint next to it and it's going to even it up. So for example, in this one where it's gotten a little bit more blurry, you can take some of that dark purple or blue violet and bring it right up. And there we have it. Here is our nocturne.